Hi, friends. Welcome to the By Faith podcast. I'm your host, Christine Hoover, and I'm so glad you're here. Each week this season, I'm talking with a guest about a specific experience in their life, letting us step into their shoes so we can learn better how to love our brothers, sisters, family members, and neighbors. This episode is sponsored by The Good Book Company, publishers of Hoping for Happiness by self-confessed recovering cynic Barnabas Piper. In this book, he helps us to throw off both the unrealistic expectations that end in disappointment and the guilty sense that Christians are not meant to have fun. He shows us how having a clear view of the reality of the fall and the promise of redemption frees us to live a life that's grounded, hopeful, and genuinely happy. Pick up a copy of Hoping for Happiness at thegoodbook.com or wherever good books are sold. Today, my guest on By Faith is Karen Loritts. Karen has been married to her husband, Crawford, for almost 50 years. She's raised 4 kids, and now she's loving being a grandmother to her many grandchildren. You're going to hear her talk about them today. Oh, and she's also been in ministry with her husband for almost 50 years. He is the pastor of a church in Georgia. So with all that experience in life, I wanted to hear from Karen what has helped her endure. What are her thoughts as an African-American woman about the big picture of race in this country since she's lived through generations of racial change? And what has she done in marriage to make it almost 50 years? Karen shares all her wisdom in today's episode. So here, friends, is my conversation with Karen Loritts. Welcome, Karen, to By Faith. I'm so glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Christine. You're so sweet to even offer me a chance to come and share.
Oh my goodness. It's more a blessing to me. I was telling you before that I got to meet you. I forget when, maybe a year ago. And then right after I met you, we ended up being on an airplane together, seated across the aisle. So I was like, this is my chance. I'm going to ask her every question I can think of. And I'm so glad to have you today because I wanted someone to come on who has life experience that can just speak to us as a little bit younger women, not for me, maybe not too much younger, but we just want to learn from your perspective. So I'm so happy to have you on today. So how about we start with you just introducing yourself? Tell us about your family and where you are and all that.
Sure. Well, my name is Karen Loritts, and I'm married to Crawford Loritts. We will celebrate coming up 50 years of marriage. We've been married 50 years come May the 22nd, 1971, we got married. And it's been a great whirlwind. And the Lord has given us 4 children, Brian, Heather, Holly, and Brendan. The guys are, Brian and Brendan are pastors, and Heather is a teacher, and Holly is a OBGYN. She and her husband are physicians. And everybody's spread out. We have 11 grandchildren, 6 grandsons, and 5 granddaughters. In fact, tonight, what we've been doing since everybody's been sheltering in place is that we, every Thursday, we were doing family game night.
Oh, yeah.
Las Vegas, Grand Rapids, Memphis, and we have family game nights to keep up with all the grandkids and things like that. So tonight we're doing the last game night and celebrating 2 birthdays of the grandkids. So we get to do that. So Zoom has been our salvation to be able to connect with everyone.
Yeah. Because where are you? You just described where the kids are, but where are you?
We are in Atlanta, Georgia. Mm-hmm. We're in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's been kind of fun.
Yeah. What games I'm sorry.
I have those virtual hugs, like that.
What games do y'all play on Zoom?
Well, believe it or not, since I'm the game master, I'm the Mimi, each child has to pick something. So they've done scavenger hunts. And can you imagine that who's ever in charge of the game that night, whatever state you're in, you come up with the game. So we've done scavenger hunts. We've done Uno, if you can believe that. We've taken the whiteboard and have done like charades and things like that. And so it's been really fun. It's been really fun. We had a show and tell. So you have to tell what you've been learning and show what you've been making and things like that, cooking. It's been really fun. It's been really
such a great idea. You must love being the game master.
Oh yeah, I'm the boss. But I give each child a chance they'll be the boss. And it's interesting.
Yeah, that sounds fun. So the kids, are they young?
Well,
grandkids?
the ones that are engaged with us with that, not the 19, almost 18 and
Oh.
16-year-old, they're either busy or working. And, but the ones we go from 13, 12, 11, 10, and then the 5 and 6-year-old, maybe, but usually the middlers and the elementary kids.
Wow.
So
I don't know if you mentioned or not, but your husband's a pastor there in Georgia. So do you all get away? I mean, I know the pandemic, that's not our normal, but do you normally get to get away and spend time with the kids and grandkids?
Oh, yes. Usually every year we've been going to Pine Cove Family Camp.
Oh, we go to Pine Cove. My kids go to Pine Cove.
Yeah, we go to the one here at Lake Hartwell and, outside of Greenville, South Carolina.
Yeah.
And this is the first year that they've opened that we haven't gotten to go. So what we did is that the 4th of July weekend, we flew in the two middlers, the 13-year-old and the almost 11-year-old. We flew them in on a plane to meet us in Atlanta, and we went to the beach.
Oh, that's good.
The other one's from Memphis, so they had sort of like a mini camp with Mimi and Papa. But yeah, that's the first time, and they were so sad.
Yeah.
So usually we always try to do something. And then this coming Thanksgiving, we rented a house like last year for all of us, the 20 of us, to meet in Las Vegas where our son lives. But now some of them says, I don't know, Mom. All of us in the house together. So I don't know. It was so sad.
I know.
And I try to get Crawford. I says, why don't we rent one of those recreational vehicles and drive out there? And he says, not really. Do a road trip. But we're going to have to do something.
Yeah. It seems like this has been hard on everyone, the pandemic, but it's been hardest on grandparents, I think.
Yeah.
Not getting to see those grandkids. Well, Karen, I would love to talk to you about your growing up. You have so many things you could offer us. I mean, we're going to hopefully touch on some of these. Been married almost 50 years. Been in ministry, is that 48 years?
49. It'll be
49 years.
Yeah.
Whoa. And raising kids and all that. But I do want to get your perspective on race and all of the issues. They're not new to us this year, but have been very, very in our face this year in our country. And so I want to get your perspective, because you, as an African American woman, you grew up during segregation, correct?
Right, but my story is a lot different. It's interesting, Christine. So here's my story. I grew up in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And when I was probably, my mother was a single parent. She had two of us. And she eventually, after a few years, got married to someone else. And but she always made sure that I'm the big sister, the oldest. And she always said, we have to find a church so you can go to Sunday school. And so we found a church, and it was a big African-American church. And I enjoyed that church. I really enjoyed my Sunday school teacher, Miss Green, and I always went back every Sunday, because the deal with my mother is that you had to go to church. You had to please God. And that was her deal, even though she didn't go to church. She just thought that her children need to know God in a certain way.
Yeah.
But I ended up wanting to leave that church because they were staying at church too long. And I was getting restless because all our friends were going to the movies. The movies open at 12:30 and we're still in church, right? So with the permission of my mom, she allowed me to find another church. And now we're living like in the suburbs. My mother married and we moved to the suburbs and found this church. And I picked church because it looked like a church, not like from where we had moved from before. And it had a big double red door, and it had stained glass windows. And so I walked into that church, and no one looked like me. I mean, there must have been probably altogether 5 Black people, and everybody else, they were white. But they embraced me. I remember the pastor came and introduced us. And my brother and I, we went into the church, and he took us to Sunday school class. The long and short of it is what was happening in this area. It was changing colors. It was white flight. White people were leaving the neighborhood, and it was turning, African American, more Black in the neighborhood. But this little church with all those white families stayed there. The Joneses, the Deacons, all of them, they just stayed there and loved that community. And the pastor came down. He's from Peter Kowalchuk, was from the Ukraine, and he had been called to this Russian-speaking church miles and miles away, but he felt led to come at the invitation of this small congregation to come and keep this church going. And so he became my pastor, Pastor Peter Kowalczyk, and he met me at the door. And Mrs. Kowalczyk, this little short little lady, grandmother little lady, she just loved him. And so they loved us. They loved us into the kingdom. And so my experience has always been majority culture, which is, I call, the whites that just love me. And so that was my whole beginning of just being able to go through these spaces. And it didn't matter the color of my skin. These people love me. I went to camp. They paid for me to go to camp if I memorized all my verses, came to Sunday school and youth group, which was called the King's Daughters and the King's Sons, and at the Kowalczyk's house. And so they loved us. And I became a Christian at the age of 14 at a youth rally that they took us to, and on and on and on. Sunday school teachers loved me. In fact, my one Sunday school teacher, I was now in high school, about to graduate, and I wanted to go to this community college, but my Sunday school teacher, she kept bugging me about, you need to go to this college, yada, and all that stuff, and I didn't pay any attention to her because I thought I knew better. You know how you think you're grown?
Yeah.
You're grown. And so I went and I moved to another area, and meanwhile, Miss Entwistle was her name. Miss Entwistle went ahead and she made application for me to go to this school called Philadelphia College of Bible. And she wanted me to meet some of the Black students there because she knew I didn't know too many students at the school. And I met this guy named Crawford Loritts. She dragged me to this concert and wanted me to meet one of the student leaders. In fact, Crawford was the president of his class. And I said, oh my gosh, but she loved me. And so Miss Entwistle, I ended up going to Philadelphia, transferring and going to Philadelphia College of Bible, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
And Pastor Peter Kowalczyk, he married us, and that became our church until we moved to Dallas, Texas. But yeah, it's incredible. So that has always been where I lived. I lived with, a lot of people just loving me for who I am. And then we joined staff with Campus Crusade, which is a majority culture too. And so that has been my things that I've been up against. Nothing, drastic as Crawford and some others. Now, as a mom, I did have to be confronted with some of the injustices that our sons had to meet. Crawford had to have the talk with them that you're African-American young men and you have to be careful how you drive and where you drive, and you will be pulled over. And yes, it has happened to our sons. Pulled over. Our youngest son, when he had graduated from Moody Bible, he had a brand new car that he got as a graduation gift to himself. And midday, this is like lunchtime, he was pulled over in downtown Chicago. And he remembered about the talk, but he was taken out of the car, his hands put on the hood of the car, and the policeman held his gun, wanting to know whose car was he driving. So we had been through a whole lot of that. Brian had been stopped in LA. So we've seen how some of this stuff has played out, and it has grieved us. And it's unfortunate that you would have to have these conversations. And now we have 6 grandsons that we have to have those talks with also. Our oldest grandson is 19 and he's driving and he's working. And especially some of the injustices that we have seen in recent days, to have the conversation with them and talking to them and things like that.
So having a perspective of decades of this, of growing up in the North and moving to Texas and having children and all of that, how do you think about the things that we've seen in the past few years with Black men being killed by police officers and all of that? What is your perspective on that? How do you think about that when you see it?
Well, the thing that gets me is that the response of my Christian brothers and sisters of the majority culture. They'll go right towards, what did they do to deserve that? There had to be something that they did to warrant their arrest or the suspicion or things like that. In fact, to be honest with you, Christine, I was very grieved when everything played out with George Floyd. It just brought to the forefront a lot of things that we have been trying, because Crawford is the great pastor of a great church that is majority culture. When he we went there, got, assigned us there in 2005, it was probably, I bet, 98% majority culture, white culture. And now it's like 76 and 24% African-American with some Hispanics there. Love the church. But you had to walk through conversations again to talk about things that are just not right. And so a lot of our people at our church, they were very grieved in the very beginning. And I remember Crawford sharing a live broadcast over Facebook, just sharing from not as the pastor of the church, but as an African-American man with sons and grandsons, and how it grieved our hearts, and how that we need to lament. So we continue just to talk and share and things like that. But to be honest with you, we still were surprised at some of the comments and some of these godly men and women in our church. And it became wearisome to have the same conversations. And everybody was upset, but then it was always, but if, you'd always have to trickle those things down. And so you want to educate people on both sides of the color line, because we both have to, we both sin. And we have to really be involved in knowing specifically what has God called us to do. How is he challenging us in this kingdom work? So my sittings have now been really working through. I've been reading the book Weep With Me. I don't know if you ever heard that. The Color of Compromise, Be the Bridge. We've been involved in the One Race movement. Which really elevated. It was great just to see humanity, the colors and the denominations all there on June 19th in Atlanta. There's 13,000 of us.
Wow.
Believers talking about the goodness of God and talking about Black Lives Matter, which we got some pushback, believe it or not, from some Christians because they can't understand the differences between looking at the moral statement that Black lives matter and the Black Lives Matter movement, which we do not agree with the Black Lives Matter movement. But the Black Lives Matter moral statement is what we were saying. So it's been an interesting journey.
Yes.
It continues. And it's okay, but it gets kind of wearisome, Christine. Yeah. It's kind of wearisome because you want to ask people, let's educate ourselves and let's move on and see where we all corporately need to address.
Could you go back and speak to what were the conversations that you were having over and over that it sounded like you were a little surprised that you were having to have those conversations over and over with Christians of the majority culture? What are some of those things so that we can know?
They would say, well, if you talk, anytime we talk about race, you just mention the race, it's sort of like, clear the room. I mean, everybody gets a little crazy, And so somebody will say, well, Karen, I'm not racist. Well, I didn't ask that. Here's the question. Are you anti-racist? That's the question. We're not saying that you're guilty of being a racist. I'm not saying that, but they will go to that. Have you ever thought about it? They'll go to that you're accusing me, or that was hundreds of years ago. I had nothing to do with that. We're not asking you to do that. We're asking you to look at, are you anti-racist? What does it mean to lament, to come into the heart of those that are feeling it and are heartbroken?
Yeah.
You may sympathize, but do you empathize with us? Do you empathize with us? And, and so people get a little nervous, and then I think there's an impatience with people, because you can see it now. Whatever the high pitch of intensity, everybody was into, let's go down there, we're going to protest and all the rest of that back in end of May. But now they're saying, everybody needs to get over it. We need to get over. We need to move on. How can we move on? Well, it's taken over 400 years to get to this point. And so, African Americans, Black and brown people just want to know, can you listen? Do you have a heart to listen? It's sort of like I've been sitting and looking at some scriptures, and I look at, how when Peter was rebuked by Paul in Galatians chapter 2. Now, Paul needed to own up to that. to his he was complicit, wasn't he?
Peter was complicit.
I'm sorry, Peter was complicit,
Yeah.
and Paul had to nail him on that. And then look at all the other passages of scriptures, in Nehemiah, or Ezra, or Daniel, when they talk about it's our sin. And I think when we get to a point when people feel as though the minority culture gets to the point where we say it's ours instead of no, it's yours or it's mine, it's ours corporately. I think that's hopeful. And I see some great things that are happening in our church, or things happen in our church. And it's been painful on both sides, tears on both sides. But can we get beyond that and not the enemy? Because we are in a spiritual battle. We are in a spiritual battle, yes. And we just need to move on. If we're hopeful that the kingdom is going to be reflected into what we say, that we are kingdom people.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine being the pastor's wife of the church that you described, and it sounds like you guys really love your church.
Oh, I
but
do.
There would be some, Andy Crouch in his book, Strong and Weak, uses the term hidden vulnerabilities to leadership. And I would think there'd be some specific hidden vulnerabilities that you would carry in that role. Specifically, I'm thinking of race. And I mean, yes, as a pastor's wife in general, but specifically in regards to race. And so I'm wondering if you could share, what would you want people to know if they could walk in your shoes? This is what you carry. And obviously you carry with hope and grace, but what is that you carry?
Well, when God assigned us to serve him, there comes a degree of risk. Because like I said, we're in a spiritual battle. I've had to learn over the years, when I'm discipling or coaching or mentoring or teaching people show you who they really are. Spiritually, in issues of race or whatever the issues are. And I've been trained through Campus Crusade for Christ for Crew on how to help a person to win them to the Lord, build them up in their faith, and then send them, become multiplying disciples. But I've also seen that sometimes we believers that we think we know a lot, that we're beyond change, because I can quote the right scriptures. They become, ants in my armor, to be honest with you, ants in my armor. So I've come to the conclusion, there are three types of people that I've now labeled and really decide that, God, you have to help me to navigate through these three types of people. There's the resistant person. A resistant person in this space as it relates to race and justice and all that is, I call them, they're Pharisees, because basically they don't want to change. And my struggle in the years before, and I know the struggle with some other people, is that how much energy does it take to help these people that are resistant to any change? They can always come up with a different narrative. They'll call something fake news or a hoax or whatever these catchwords that they want to use, and they won't change. But then there are those reluctant people that maybe they just are undereducated, or maybe they believe that they culturally know what history really is, but they haven't educated themselves on the full comprehensiveness of history and advantage themselves to finding things out about another culture or another ethnicity. There's hope for them. There's hope for them. And then there's a group called the Ready People. And we've seen out of all this stuff that happened with the protests, unfortunately, all the chaos with a small percentage of knuckleheads, I call them knuckleheads, that wanted to throw riot into the mix. Mm-hmm. That didn't mean any good. But there are a lot of people that have come up and said, I want to know, because I've never have experienced this before, upfront and personal. These young people, even some older people, are saying, I want to learn, I want to know. And those are the Ready People. And I'm saying, yeah, we can do something. So let's read a book together. There's a group that we're going to be doing the book study on Week with Me. Mm-hmm. And that author, as you know, is Vice President Mike Pence, is a member of his church. And his book is telling us how to lament. He has these 5 stages. And this is how we are going to help disciple the people, especially the reluctant and the ready. Is that he says, hey, first of all, we need to become good listeners, to love, become good listeners, to learn from them, to lament, and leverage what we're learning to help the next brother or sister in Christ. Mm-hmm. Crawford has just finished a series at our church on the one another's in the Bible. There's like over 20 of them.
Wow.
He didn't do all 20. He did about 9, he and some of the other staff. And he started off with the love one another. And that's all that it's calling us to do, to love one another. But you just don't stop there. You don't stop there. And so we don't talk politics. We just talk Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Let that elevate the conversation, because we can agree on that let's see what the Bible has to say and how can we help each other to become well.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I'm going to have to look up those sermons. I'm wondering, with having decades of perspective, so you remember the civil rights era. You were, I guess, were you a teenager then? I mean, you remember parts of our history that some of us we did not live through. And so sometimes I think we can become kind of tunnel vision about our generation and what we're experiencing, and we forget that people have been through some of these things before. And so I'm wondering what perspective you could give us of kind of the big picture of what you've seen. Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel that we're just rehashing history and nothing is changing? What is your perspective?
Oh yeah, I'm so hopeful, because we're looking at those 13,000 people, all colors, all ages. There was a sense of hopefulness, unlike what happened in the 60s, because basically it was garnered by, African Americans and a little bit about the church. Mm-hmm. But now you're having young people. I love young people, and people that are saying, some things are just not right. Mm-hmm. And when you see it on right before your eyes on television, and it grips you, then they're saying there's no turning back. Mm-hmm. So I'm more hopeful that we're now going to say, okay, we're going to garner that, take that moment, and then we're going to do what is right to do. I'm more hopeful than what happens because, you hear about the lynchings and all the rest of that. You can't even have pictures of that really on the front page or people talking about that all the time. But here, with the conversations, even with all those weeks and weeks of the protests, we're talking about the peaceful protests. The peaceful protests. It did something to people. Mm-hmm. It did something to older people and young people, Black people and white people. It did something to us. And I don't think that's going to go away. The problem is that the church now is calling to account. What are you going to do about it, church? What are you going to do about it? You talk about the Good Samaritan. The only person that stopped with this after the Samaritan was beat up on the side of the road was not the priest, not the lawyer, but a man that no one wanted to be involved with, a Samaritan, right? So people are saying, okay, now let's not be the one that bypass that person that was beaten almost to the end of his life. We're going to stop and do something. So I'm really hopeful. Yeah. I'm really hopeful.
Well, I'm good. I'm hopeful too. I'm hopeful that the church is going to take her rightful place in this and lead the way. That's what I want.
And we have to be patient with both on both sides. We have to be, as a minority culture, African American, I have to be patient that I'm going to have the conversation again, and that's okay. But also the majority race need to say it can't happen overnight. Just, it takes relationships. It takes you sitting a while and feeling the pain, lamenting with your brothers and sisters, and then to together do something. Not saying, okay, I've done that. I've done the march. I've done the protest. We should be better now. No, we're not going to be better. It's systemic. Systemic has affected our whole country.
Mm-hmm. Well, Karen, my theme for this season is in their shoes. And one more question about race, and then we can move on. But I would just love to know, is there anything that you wish that people would ask you specifically about being an African-American woman, Christian, wife, mom, that they don't ask or that they're afraid to ask? And could you answer that question?
You'll ask me, like, why are you in a white church? I mean, if it's, Karen, I don't know why you put up with all that, because it's so hard. I mean, again, another conversation. Why don't you just go where it's easy? Well, my thing is that God called me. Wherever God calls me, I better be obedient to go where he's called me. And believe it or not, God will empower me to fulfill my calling. And I better obey. Mm-hmm. I better obey. Is it easy to go back to a church? I don't have to worry about the music. Stay there for a long time. Somebody asked me, how can you be in a church, talking about a black church? How come you stay in church for so long? I mean, a white lady asked me that. In fact, I was speaking at a conference, a retreat with all, white people, majority culture. And, well, Karen, how can you be at church so long? And I says, well, let me explain it this way. When we were being beaten in the cotton fields, and when it came time for us to have that day of rest that our master gave us on a Sunday, it was a time for us to dress up and we're going to stay together as long as we can. And so they just says, oh, okay. But that was our time of work. That's a time when we can come together. Don't have to have any of these kinds of things you have to, what I call have a code switching. Yeah, code switching. The way I deal with the white people is different than the way I deal with the black people. All that kind of foolishness. I can just go to church, listen to my music, and just stay there as long as the pastor wants to preach us into the next afternoon. Whatever. But I have to obey God. When I committed my life to the Lord as a high school graduate, I says, Lord, wherever you want to take me, whatever you want to do. And so that's what I do.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear more about that, about ministry, because as I was preparing for this interview, the word endurance just came to mind. I mean, 50 years of marriage, 50 years of ministry, raising kids, all these things you've just talked about, being patient through affliction, that takes endurance. So can you speak to us about that? What has helped you to endure in the faith?
Well, God knew that I needed to put some people in my life that what he did, he just brought those people into my life. So I always tell people that you need to have, especially women, you need to have 3 types of people in your life. You need to have an Elizabeth, you need to have a Martha, and you need to have a Mary. Elizabeth, God gave me Mrs. Margaret Ponder. She's now home with the Lord for the last 15 years. But when I was young and raising our children, and we moved to Atlanta after church planting in Texas, and the Lord moved us to Atlanta, where we've been for over 40 some years, he placed this godly African-American woman that was abandoned by her husband with 6 kids. And she raised some godly children. But she just loved me. And she was the type of person that would, gently answer me questions that really got all into my business.
Yep.
Karen, how's your marriage? How are you doing? And, or Karen, you don't look well today. And so she would ask me pointed questions about how was I treat my husband, or she could tell that we just had I call him, a kind of conversation, a marital adjustment conversation. I never call it an argument. Marital adjustment conversation. She could tell when it came from the front door that how are things coming. And she would always, because she was a godly woman, she would always give me scripture. And in the middle of the week, she would just call me and say, Karen, God laid you on my heart and I want to pray with you. And at that time, I was tired of being a mom. I had been trained on Campus Crusade for Christ crew staff, and I was leading Bible studies at college campuses, and now I'm stuck with these children, feeling lost, that I would never learn how to talk proper to people anymore. Mm-hmm. But God always had my Elizabeth to challenge me. And so she really helped me. Or even in the way I dress, sometimes she says, give me a little extra money, thinking that I needed to dress up a little bit more. Nothing about, I was always modest, but I just didn't look as though I cared about myself, whatever. Or, Karen, do you need to go to this beauty salon? Or, Elizabeth. So she not only did that spiritually, but she just loved me, coached me through life, and gave me some tips on things, or called me over to her house to watch her without telling me, you need to do this. So it was informal times. Don't we need someone?
Yes.
And all of her children have turned out great. But she took the time to love on this little 20 and 30-year-old woman that almost was losing her way, because Crawford was traveling with crew. I was raising these children. We're now about to have our fourth child. And it was just crazy. And she just knew she needed God knew, send her. So, there'll be something, because I had a position. My husband's in leadership, and I needed to own up, and I needed to work on Karen. To be able to give my husband and children something, because he had called us long term. So I love her. And then everyone needs what I call a Martha, a buddy, a peer, that we can go cry on each other's shoulders, and not commiserate to a point that we're just grappling and just whining. We call each other up, and read the Bible and things like that. And then been able to share that with younger women. We all have a responsibility to have, and those are informal times. And the Lord used that greatly.
Yeah. It seems like, oh yes, I'm sure. It seems like you're pretty passionate about discipling younger women. You talked about how you love younger people, and
yes,
tell us about that and your passion for that.
Yes. So there are now several women that I get to do life with, and it's nothing like sitting down and just opening a book and do, because everyone's at different. So you always have to, especially when we have little ones and toddlers or elementary school, just call them over and says, why don't we just chit chat and things like that, and making yourself available, or go down to Dunkin' Donuts. And they'll ask, we bring some of our friends and things like that. And this is, whatever you want to talk to me about. And we'll do that. I'll just share some of the things that I've learned the hard way, or share books or things like that, enter into their birthday times, and even going over and giving them opportunities to go on a date with their husbands. Because a lot of times people won't say a lot of things that they're going through, but what's happening.
Yeah.
Just being available. And then there are those formal times where you sit down and says, okay, for the next 6 weeks, this is what we're going to do. Do you have any time to do that? Even on the Zoom times, we can have some Zoom times. I did a social distancing, just a little on the back patio with a friend who had a birthday. Remembering those little things, making time for people, because everyone time is so crunched up. And even those that are now having to homeschool their children, finding those times, just call me whenever you need any information, or just shoot them a little text and things like that. So it kind of creative this way. But people want to know that there's some place that they can go safe, that they can share, and that they can be themselves without having to put on all kinds of disguises. And even when we were having church planners, I would meet with their wives, because as a church planner, I know that it was hard. Everything rests on you. And as a pastor's wife, you can't go around telling everybody and crying to the members about, I don't want to do this and all that. So I always had them together. There was about 5 or 6 of them. So we dealt with a book, or we had a structured time.
Yeah.
Do that. Yeah.
That's
Give
great.
them a safe place to do. You know what I mean? Because they didn't go to seminary and get that at seminary.
Right.
But they were able to talk with me, and I was able to tell them from point blank on how hard it was in church planning. And then being a pastor's wife, what does that mean? As God, I'm a 3-ring circus person, so I can do a lot of spinning the plates. But there are some women, God has just called me just to do this one thing.
Yeah.
And I want to do it well. And you know what? That's okay.
Yeah.
And they just want to know, is that okay? That's okay, but just don't stay there and not grow in that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good advice right there.
Right. Because after a while, I've seen some women that says, I can never do anything. And really, you minimize those things that, maybe God wants to grow you. And so, yeah.
That's right. I agree. What do you tell them about what you've learned the hard way in marriage?
In marriage. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And so my mother was a single parent. She got married for a while, and then she got a divorce. It's crazy. But so I didn't have any role models in the home for what marriage lasts. Now, Crawford comes from this great family. His mother and daddy, before his father went home to be with the Lord, they were married for 54 years.
Wow.
His father was one of 14 kids, and all the ones that were married averaged, before they passed away, 45 to 50 plus years.
Wow.
And then the Lord says, ha, 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 I'm going to let you know a young lady who is completely the opposite, from the city and from the streets of Philadelphia, put them together. And I remember, listen, this is so crazy. So I remember when we got married on May the 22nd, and we were leaving for our honeymoon. So we went out to this like little secluded kind of place out in the, it was a beautiful place outside of Philadelphia. And the last night before we were going to come back down to the city, I was in the bathroom preparing because we were going to go out to dinner. And I looked in the mirror, Christine, and I started crying. I was weeping. I says, oh my gosh. Days ago, I had made this commitment, this vow that I would love, honor, and submit and all the rest of this good stuff. And now I have to go down, and this guy is going to be very disappointed. And I just cried out to God. I was crying. I says, God, you have got to help me, because I made a vow. I made a vow in front of my mom, my aunties, my college friends. The president of the college was there. And Pastor Kowalczyk married us, and I said that, and I meant that, but now I have to live it, and I am clueless. At that point, I knew that I was ready to be a bride, but I was not prepared to be a wife. And I was now on ramping it up on what it meant to be a wife. So I always tell people, you need to worry more about what it means to be a wife in your covenant marriage. Get the books, get between the lines with people, couples that are mentors, spiritual men and women that are couples that you can go to and says, we want to sit with you for a while, either before we say I do, but for sure after we say I do. And let us see what marriage is all about. Can I come to you and talk to you about those things? And you need to do that. Go out to some marriage conferences. There, everything we need to know to keep this marriage going, it's available to us. And so I availed myself to that. Like I had Mrs. Ponder, who abandoned, but she always would make sure that I knew the people who had couples in the church to go to them and things like that, or people giving me books to read. And then just going when I just was at my wit's end, another marital adjustment time with Crawford. Can he get with it? Someone would always, I can go to someone and find those things out that I was. And then God would always bring back, carrying your commitment to Scripture, what the Scripture has to say. And I would be so upset. I says, I don't like the submission part. I don't like the submission part. And that was a good place to start. That was a good place to start.
Yeah.
Because when you admit it, that, listen, marriage is hard. Like I said, I've been married almost 50 years. I love this man with all my heart, but marriage is hard, and we're still learning. We're still learning, especially with this pandemic. I'm having a cook, and he doesn't like leftovers.
Oh, my husband doesn't either.
Because his mother she cooked 3 different entrees every day.
Oh no, that's shoes to fill.
Oh yes. So anyway.
That's so funny. Well, I'd love to just close knowing what are some of the best things you've done that have helped you guys to stay married and loving one another for this long that we can emulate.
Well, like I said, what was crazy with God, God is just so funny. So when we are now with crew staff, we have at that point 2 children, and Crawford's on the national team or something like that. And we were asked to be part of the speaker team for marriage. Now, is that crazy? But what that did is that we had this manual that we had to teach from. Before you get up in front of hundreds and thousands of people, you have to really tell the truth about that.
Right.
And so one of the things I learned is that my marriage has got to tell the truth about God. And so availing yourself with materials, with conferences, whatever you need to do that you are lacking, you ask God, he will do that. And he did that too. I mean, I would never tell people to do that. Go into leadership position, take this big position, then start speaking on an issue that you really just really slack about. But God has a way of just, helping you to get to where he wants you to be. So those are the things. But there's a lot of things. Just having some godly couples, multi-generational. Just don't have your Sunday school class be all about your age group. Bust into the senior class or something like that. So I just want to sit here with all you seniors who've been married 40, 50, 60 years and just hear, how did it work out for you, Yeah.
That's good.
Isn't that a good idea?
Bust in there. That's right.
I'm just going to have a sit-in right here. Invite them over to your house. We've had older couples that come into our house, and you watch the interaction between them, and you learn from them. Yeah. And do the same with young couples too. Yes.
Well, you're talking so much about relationship, and I know that some people are listening or thinking, I'm a pastor's wife and I don't know, how do I find these people? How do I find an older woman that will pour into me? How do I find a friend? And you seem to have gotten that down.
Right.
So what advice would you give us about that?
Well, the thing about church people is that a lot of times church people think they know a lot about my life. They really don't know a lot about my life, because you only let them know what you want them to know, but you want to keep them, in the relationship. There's other people in other churches that you can become friends with, other pastors' wives, and says, hey, we live here in Roswell, you're in there in Woodstock. Let's get together and just have, some coffee or tea or something together. How's it going for you? You know what I mean?
Yep.
With all the women that we did in our church planning, those 6 wives, they can't talk to the people in their church. They're friends.
Right.
But they can come because they all have the same thing. And so they come together as a community.
Yes.
And so I would say that's what, if you're in a leadership position, you need some people outside of your immediate church family, church group. And those, because that's helpful on both sides.
Yeah.
And it's been helpful for me too.
Yeah. Karen, this has been so good. We've touched on so many things, but this is exactly what I hoped that would come out of this. It's just,
you're so sweet.
Perspective and reminding us of our hope, and that God gives us what we need all throughout whatever he's called us to do. And you've called us to obedience to that too, by your example and your words today. So thank you so much for joining me. This has been so fun.
Thank you for having me. This is great. I love it. And I love your word, by faith. What a great podcast.
Well, it did, Hebrews 11. By faith.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Karen. As always, thank you so much for listening to By Faith. I would be so honored if you'd leave a review on iTunes or share the podcast with a friend. Join me next week as I talk with Sheridan Voisey. Sheridan shares about how his life didn't go according to plan. He and his wife tried for many years to have a baby and eventually discovered that would not be possible for them. Sheridan shares about infertility, failed IVF treatments, and even a failed adoption. Sheridan talks about infertility from a man's perspective and shares how he's learned to recycle broken dreams into service, and he explains what that means next week. He also shares how we can support infertile couples in our own lives. This is such a needed and important conversation, so I hope that you'll join me for it next week. Until then, friends, have a great week and keep walking forward by faith.